Okay, so you want to own a house in New York City. Find a brownstone, sign the deed, hang a welcome mat on a stoop in Brooklyn. But here's the strange part. Owning a house in New York City is one of the only real estate transactions in America where the purchase price is almost never the number that determines whether you can actually afford to live there, and where the government sends you a bill every single year that can rival a second mortgage, calculated using a formula almost nobody who owns the house actually understands. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why a $3 million townhouse in Brooklyn can cost more to hold on to than a $10 million house in Texas, how New York's property tax system quietly punishes homeowners while protecting landlords, and why co-ops, the strangest form of homeownership in America, exist almost nowhere else and dominate the market anyway. Let's start with what a house actually costs to buy, and the number changes completely depending on which borough and which category of ownership you're talking about. Because New York doesn't really have one housing market, it has at least four running in parallel. A single-family townhouse in an outer borough neighborhood, somewhere in Queens or the further reaches of Brooklyn, runs anywhere from $800,000 to $1.5 million. A classic Brooklyn brownstone in a desirable neighborhood like Park Slope or Cobble Hill runs $3 million to $6 million, sometimes considerably more, for a fully renovated multifamily version with rental income built in. A townhouse in Manhattan, the genuinely rare kind, since the borough is overwhelmingly apartments, starts around $5 million and climbs into the tens of millions for anything in the West Village or the Upper East Side. And then there's the fourth category, which barely exists anywhere else in the country in this volume, the co-op apartment, which isn't technically a house at all, but functions as the dominant form of owned housing across huge swaths of Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn and Queens. Here's where things get structurally strange, and it's worth understanding before we even get to the money. A co-op isn't real estate in the traditional sense. When you buy a co-op apartment, you're not buying the unit. You're buying shares in a corporation that owns the entire building, and those shares come with a proprietary lease, giving you the right to occupy one specific apartment. This structure exists because of a wave of building conversions in New York starting in the mid-20th century, when landlords converted rental buildings into resident-owned corporations, and it stuck because it gave buildings enormous control over who could live there. That control is the entire point, and it's also the biggest risk to a buyer. Every co-op has a board, elected by the shareholders, and every prospective buyer has to be personally approved by that board before the sale can close. Co-op boards can, and regularly do, reject buyers for reasons that would be illegal in almost any other type of real estate transaction: insufficient liquid assets after the down payment, a debt-to-income ratio the board doesn't like, sometimes reasons the board never has to disclose at all. Some of the most famous co-op rejections in New York history involve celebrities and business figures with plenty of money turned down simply because the board decided they didn't fit. If you're buying a co-op, the seller can accept your offer, and you can still lose the apartment because a group of your future neighbors voted no. Condos don't have this problem. A condo is real property. You own your unit outright the way you'd own a house anywhere else, and condo boards typically only have a right of first refusal, not full approval power, meaning they almost never actually block a sale. That flexibility is exactly why condos trade at a meaningful premium over co-ops for comparable space, often 20 to 30% more per square foot in the same building type in the same neighborhood, purely for the difference in how much control you retain over your own asset. So that's the purchase price landscape. Now let's get to the number that actually decides whether you can afford to keep the house once you own it, because in New York, that number is not the mortgage. Property taxes in New York City are calculated through one of the most convoluted formulas in American local government, and understanding even the basic shape of it explains a huge amount of the frustration long-time homeowners have with the system. New York City splits residential property into different tax classes. Class 1 covers most 1, 2, and 3 family homes, the actual houses. Class 2 covers co-ops, condos, and larger rental buildings. And critically, the two classes are taxed at completely different effective rates and assessed using completely different methods, which is where the real distortion lives. For Class 1 properties, actual houses, the city caps how much your assessed value can increase each year, typically limited to 6% annually and 20% over 5 years, regardless of how much the market value of your house has actually gone up. This sounds like a benefit, and in the short term it is. But it means houses that have appreciated dramatically over decades are often still being taxed on an assessed value far below their real market value, while houses purchased more recently, or in gentrifying neighborhoods where values spiked quickly, get caught by the cap in a way that creates wildly uneven tax bills on objectively similar houses sitting next to each other. For Class 2 properties, co-ops and condos, the assessment method is even stranger. Instead of being assessed based on what the unit could sell for, city assessors are required by state law to value co-ops and condos as if they were rental buildings, essentially asking what rent the building could generate if every unit were leased out, then working backward from that hypothetical rental income to an assessed value. This produces assessments that often bear only a loose relationship to actual sale prices, and it's been the subject of lawsuits and reform proposals for decades because it can result in a luxury Manhattan co-op being assessed, for tax purposes, far below its true market value, while a modest outer borough house, one class over, pays a proportionally heavier share. The practical result of this two-tier system is that Class 1 homeowners, the people who actually own houses, often end up paying a higher effective tax rate relative to their property's true market value than owners of far more expensive co-ops and condos in Manhattan. It's a system that, on paper, is supposed to protect middle-class homeowners, and in practice frequently does the opposite once you compare effective rates across classes. On top of the base property tax, New York adds several other line items that surprise first-time buyers. There's a mansion tax, an additional transfer tax that kicks in on any residential purchase of $1 million or more, starting at 1% and rising in tiers up to 3.9% for properties over $25 million. Since the median house price in most of Brooklyn and Manhattan now clears that $1 million threshold easily, this tax applies to a huge share of ordinary house purchases in the city, not just genuine mansions, a detail the tax's name doesn't really convey anymore. Then there's the transfer tax paid at closing, which in New York City runs 1 to 1.425% of the sale price depending on the amount, on top of New York State's own transfer tax. Combined, buyer-side closing costs on a New York house purchase typically run 4 to 6% of the purchase price, once you include mansion tax, transfer taxes, title insurance, mortgage recording tax, and attorney fees, meaningfully higher than the 2 to 3% buyers pay in most other American cities. Now let's talk about ongoing costs beyond the tax bill, because owning an actual house in New York City comes with its own specific maintenance economics that don't apply the same way in the suburbs. A significant share of New York's housing stock is over a century old. Brownstones in Brooklyn were largely built between the 1870s and 1900s. That means original plumbing, original masonry, and facades that fall under New York City's Local Law 11, which requires building owners to have their facades inspected every 5 years and make any necessary repairs, because falling masonry from aging building exteriors has caused fatal accidents in the city. Facade repair on a brownstone can run anywhere from $20,000 for minor pointing work to well over $200,000 for a full masonry restoration, and it's not optional. It's a legal requirement enforced with fines for non-compliance. Heating oil versus gas conversion is another cost specific to older New York housing stock, since the city has phased in restrictions on the dirtiest grades of heating oil over the past decade, pushing many older homeowners into boiler replacements or fuel conversions that can run tens of thousands of dollars. And starting in 2024, New York City's Local Law 97 began requiring large buildings to meet new carbon emissions caps, with escalating fines for buildings that don't comply, a policy primarily aimed at larger buildings, but one that's pulling smaller multifamily properties into its scope over time as the thresholds phase down. So here's the honest math on what owning a New York City house actually looks like once every layer is stacked together. On a $3.5 million Brooklyn brownstone, property taxes alone might run $15,000 to $25,000 a year, depending on the specific block and assessment history. Insurance for an older masonry building in a dense urban environment runs higher than a comparable suburban house, often $5,000 to $10,000 a year. Facade maintenance reserves, if you're being responsible about Local Law 11, should realistically budget several $1,000s a year, even in a non-inspection year, since violations from a previous cycle often carry forward. And if the house is a multifamily brownstone with rental units, which a huge share of them are, you're also now a landlord subject to New York's rent stabilization laws if any unit was ever rent stabilized in its history, a status that follows the apartment, not the owner, and can dramatically limit how much you're allowed to raise rent or how easily you can renovate and re-rent a vacant unit. This is where a lot of new brownstone buyers get genuinely surprised. They buy a 3-family townhouse expecting the rental income from the 2 non-owner units to substantially offset their mortgage, and then discover one of those units has been rent stabilized since a tenant moved in decades earlier, meaning the rent is legally capped far below market rate, and the tenant has strong legal protections against eviction that exist independent of who currently owns the building. Now let's talk about what happens when this doesn't work, because New York has real, specific stories that show exactly where the math breaks. Some of the most visible failures in recent years have been older owners in gentrifying Brooklyn neighborhoods, families who bought a brownstone decades ago for a fraction of today's price, watched the neighborhood's value climb into the millions, and found themselves asset-rich but cash-poor, unable to afford the property tax bill and facade maintenance costs on fixed retirement incomes, despite technically owning a multi-million-dollar property. This exact scenario has driven a steady stream of older homeowners in neighborhoods like Bedford-Stuyvesant and Crown Heights to sell to developers or investors, not because they wanted to leave, but because the annual carrying costs on paper wealth they couldn't easily access became unsustainable. On the co-op side, board rejections have created real financial casualties too. Buyers who've already sold their previous home moved money into a co-op purchase account and lined up financing, only to be rejected by a board months into the process, sometimes lose deposits, bridge financing costs, and months of carrying 2 housing situations at once, a risk that simply doesn't exist in a condo or house purchase. Step back for a second, because the paradox here is sharp, similar in shape to the casino and the mall, but built entirely out of tax policy instead of gaming math or lease structure. New York City real estate is some of the most reliably appreciating property in the country over any multi-decade window. And yet the annual cost of simply holding on to that appreciation, taxes calculated through one of the most opaque formulas in American local government, mandatory facade and emissions compliance on aging buildings, and in co-ops, a board that can override the free market at any point in the transaction, makes ownership genuinely precarious for anyone without significant liquid income on top of the asset itself. The mathematical floor, long-term appreciation in one of the most land-constrained cities on Earth, is essentially guaranteed. Everything built on top of it, your tax class, your building's age, your board, your zoning, is where the real risk lives. Time to pull it together and answer the actual question: how much does it actually cost to own a house in New York City, and what do you actually get? 2 scenarios, real numbers. Scenario 1. A 3-family brownstone in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. Purchase price around $2.2 million. Annual property tax around $12,000. 2 rental units generating combined income of roughly $60,000 a year, one of them rent stabilized and capped below market. Insurance, facade maintenance reserve, and basic upkeep run another $15,000 to $20,000 a year. After mortgage costs on a typical down payment, net carrying cost to the owner-occupant, after rental income offset, lands somewhere around $2,000 to $4,000 a month out of pocket, on top of building equity in an asset that's appreciated an average of 5 to 7% annually in this neighborhood over the past decade. Scenario 2. A Manhattan co-op on the Upper West Side. Purchase price around $4 million for a large Classic 6 apartment. Monthly maintenance fee, which covers building staff, the underlying mortgage on the building itself, and a share of the building's property tax, running $6,000 to $9,000 a month, a cost that exists whether or not you have a personal mortgage on top of it. Add mortgage costs and you're looking at total monthly carrying costs that can exceed $15,000 a month for a property with no rental income potential at all, since most co-op boards restrict or outright ban subletting. That's the entire business in one sentence. A house or an apartment in New York City is one of the best long-term stores of value in American real estate, and one of the most expensive, least transparent, and least forgiving assets to actually hold on to in the meantime. So if you decide to buy a house in New York City, just remember the one rule that actually decides whether the math works for you or against you. It was never really about the purchase price. It was always about whether you can afford to keep paying to own something you already paid for.